Mute your phone.
Mobile phone off.
I'm going to right now. Claire is going to inform me something about my electric bill or something. I don't know.
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Jerry Nolan. It's a great pleasure to be co-moderating this with Claire Morden. Claire, if you can introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Claire Morden. I'm an intensive care trainee in England and also current chair of the Young ERC. So thank you for having me.
Should have added I'm currently chair of the ERC, for those of you who didn't realise that, and I'm practising as an intensivist in Bath in the UK. It's a huge pleasure to welcome four really key people in the resuscitation world, all from North America, hence the title of this session, the Late Night Evening from North America. I'm going to get each of the panellists to introduce themselves, and I'll start, no particular order, I'm going to start with Mary Fran.
Hi, I'm Mary Fran Hazinski. I'm a pediatric critical care nurse by background, but since 1999, I've been either editor or co-editor of the American Heart Association guidelines. And I've also had since 2000 the privilege of co-editing the co-star with Jerry Nolan since 2005. So I'm pleased to be here and honored to be among such prestigious panelists.
Thanks, Mary Fran. And Laurie?
I'm Laurie Morrison. I'm an emergency physician and a clinician scientist at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Canada. And I don't think I have any conflicts of interest, but I have worked with this entire group for probably 15 years as we carve out the science in resus. And it is an honor to be here with all of you tonight and to be supporting the ERC's first virtual, because this is a big step for all of us and you're doing a great job.
Thanks, Laurie. And then Bob?
I'm Bob Berg. I'm a pediatric intensivist and a resuscitation scientist, both doing laboratory and clinical resuscitation work. I've had the great pleasure of working with everybody here and being back to the ERC for again. And I just want to thank all of you heroes out there. You're the front line with this whole, always, but even more so. I thank you last year at this meeting for all you do. And I'll double down on that in the days of this pandemic. You guys are what makes the difference in keeping us alive and well. And I just want to thank you all for that.
Thanks very much indeed, Bob. And last but certainly not least, Lance.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Late Night. I hope all of you are at least drinking some wine or some whiskey or something like that. My name is Lance Becker. I'm the chairman of emergency medicine and a practicing emergency medicine physician in New York. I've had the pleasure of being involved in resuscitation research for years and years, and to get a chance to be here with Bob and Mary Fran and Laurie and Jerry is just spectacular. So it's such an honor to be here.
Thanks, Lance. That's great. So just before we get underway, just to remind you all, please use the Slido for asking any questions. And I should point out that whilst we have a vague plan for the structure of this session, it is very flexible. So we'll be looking at what's coming in on the Slido and we can be pushed really in any direction. And I know the four panelists are hugely experienced in all areas of resuscitation, and I'm sure they'll take on any question that you can fire at them. Having said that, we're going to start with COVID-19. And I'm going to start by asking Laurie what impact COVID-19 has had on particularly out of hospital cardiac arrest in I'll say North America. We may get an American perspective in a moment.
So the protected code blue has, I think, in essence, just prolonged our response times predictably. And we don't have any clear data, although there are some early papers coming out suggesting that bystander reluctance is also an issue. So I think everyone is concerned that overall survival during the pandemic of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, which is so dependent on our response times and engaging our community to do what's right first, that it will have a negative impact on outcomes. And we've seen some early data out of Seattle to suggest that perhaps that is the case. We're messaging as clearly as we can here in Canada that it's normal. Everybody should, that the majority of cardiac arrests are occurring in the home, and there are loved ones there within our COVID circle, and we should still adopt the same approach. It's the public ones where protected blue, code blues, I think will have the most negative impact.
Thanks, Laurie. Lance, any thoughts? I guess you kind of cross over seeing a bit of out of hospital and then in hospital as well as an emergency physician. What's your take?
Well, so we were, COVID had a huge impact in New York, and I was in New York for the surge. It was it was just such a challenging time. And to be really blunt about it, I'm not like psychologically over it. I the issues around sort of mental health are looming large for all of us. And if I was smart, I would see a counselor immediately. Do you know what I mean? And, but it just in terms of some of the things that we saw is that we saw rates of death that we had just never seen before. Typically in an emergency department, you might have 1 or 2 unexpected deaths in a week. All right. And we were seeing 6, 7, 8 people being pronounced dead every single day. And so that took just an enormous toll on all of our providers, our nurses. My critical care colleagues are still just, maybe Bob will speak to that a little bit. But so it's just had enormous impact in the United States. And of course, we really got sort of hammered with 2 or 3 real pandemics that all came at the same time. That there was the infection, and there was also certainly just major issues in the United States around disparities, around racism, around essentially the murder of vulnerable individuals who were sort of out in public. And that was a second pandemic that sort of just hammered us at the same time. And so I think this is still something that we're all very much dealing with. And, this is a real time for reflection in terms of what resuscitation means. How do we protect our communities? How do we work together? We are at a momentous moment of opportunity.
And just before we move on to one of the other panelists, Lance, where are you in the sort of waves, as it were? Because we were all aware of a big hit in New York earlier on. Are you kind of in between surges now?
We've actually had a little tick up just in the last week. Everyone is sort of following. There are some particular neighborhoods that have had upticks. In general, New York is much better than most of the rest of the United States right now. The overall rates are relatively low, but there are some neighborhoods where it's as high as 5% positivity, which is just outrageously high. The state itself is a little under 1%, but I think that, a big issue is how do people feel? And I think that people are very anxious. I think that, and rightfully so. I think people are afraid. I think that we see a lot of behaviors that we didn't see a year ago. People coming to the emergency department, people not coming to the emergency department. And so, we know that we're losing people because people who need to come for medical care are not coming for medical care. And so what's our responsibility to try to help some of those people? So we are, I think where we are is we're sort of, everyone is just like, well, we got through that first wave. What is coming next? And we are watching the election. The American election is going to be an enormous thing that's going to affect both the United States and even Canada, and yes, even Europe. And so, there's just lots that's really rolling at North America right now.
Okay, thanks, Lance. Bob, can I come to you next and just get your take on perhaps in-hospital cardiac arrest and the impact of COVID that you've seen from that?
So I'm a pediatric intensivist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, but I also, our building is abutted to the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, which is a large adult hospital. And I'm quite familiar with what's going on. We actually benefited from New York and Boston that beat us by about 2 weeks or 3 weeks in terms of severity of the problem. So there was an enormous amount of planning that went on between intensive care doctors and and CMOs of hospitals, the chief medical officers, et cetera. And most of us learned from them that we had to spend about 2 hours a day on planning with leaders of the hospital and organizing things so that we could be prepared. And as such, we sort of shut down our operating rooms from anything that was non-emergent. We changed what the exposure of everybody in the hospital was and what kind of rooms could take care of COVID and how we dealt with it. Like probably everybody on this phone call, as it started, we really didn't know how to protect each other. We didn't have all the equipment to protect each other. We were worried about what we were going to run out of. And there was different rules every few days for the first few weeks in terms of how do we make sure that everything was okay. Because of this, we organized systems, and we did this through the American Heart Association also with recommendations similar to what you're doing in Europe and everywhere in terms of how we protect ourselves before we touch somebody. Well, what does that mean? That means that it takes longer to get to the patient. That means there's less people in the room initially. It's a frightening event. It also means that for trainees, with aerosol generating procedures, we want to make sure that the most skilled person does the intubation. Well, that younger trainee is not getting a chance. In fact, they may not be allowed in the room because we're trying to protect that room and we're limiting the number of people in there. So I think what it does in terms of training, what it does in terms of stress, what it does in terms of the management of resuscitation. There was just a recent publication from Beaumont Hospital in the Detroit area, a large private hospital with training programs that had a 0% survival rate among people that had COVID and got in-hospital CPR. And I know that there are many parts to this thing, but it's really obvious to all of us that we are trying to protect ourselves, which means that we're putting our patients at danger, and the decision-making about who is the appropriate one to get CPR is a tense issue. There's a lot more talked about than worry about in Philadelphia area. We were pretty lucky. I should just say that Detroit was overwhelmed just like New York was overwhelmed when that all was going on. And there really were not enough providers. So the other thing that we've had happen, I'm sure that other people in the audience have had this happen, is subgroups would be having a meeting at the beginning of this and expose a third of the trainees or a third of the faculty members would no longer be available. It meant the other 2/3 of us were overwhelmed because we were covering for them. And then I think the other thing that was touched upon by Lance, perhaps on a less intense level, is we have a large percentage of people that are young, both in trainees and faculty, and providers, particularly in intensive care units. The nurses tend to be on the young side and then go off to administration when they're older. They have kids. They don't know what they're doing with their kids in school. They get called. Their schools are half a day. They got to be there on time and drop them off, and then they got to get back there and be there exactly on time. And there still have to be providers in hospitals, and they are going crazy in terms of anxiety. What's the future, et cetera.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, it's interesting to hear that, Bob, because a lot of what you're saying, I think, is reflected probably in around the world, actually. And what I'm expecting is that the audience are thinking, yeah, we'll see exactly the same. We're all being affected by this. Mary Fran, I'll come to you as well. Any additional thoughts?
Yeah, a couple things. We are seeing in most states now a surge, and they're calling it the third wave, but it's going to soon be complicated by the flu, and differentiating the two will be difficult. You know, when does somebody come in? You know, and so we've got COVID hotlines set up, but this issue has had a huge impact on training across the board, training for residents and training for new nurses, trying to give them the experience, as Bob talked about, but also training outside of the hospital, training of lay rescuers, training with mannequins, and many times training has had to be simply suspended. And we know that those in-person skills are critical. I'll make one last point too, and I think Lance touched upon it. We now know that in the United States, we have more than 250,000 excess deaths during this COVID time. So we think that that means that people are, for example, getting chest pain, they're not calling into the hospital, and then they have an arrhythmic cardiac arrest at home with maybe someone there, maybe not. In terms of children, when we talk about they need breaths, we think when they have a cardiac arrest typically. So the good news is that they tend to be at home when they, during this COVID time, they tend to be at home with parents or loved ones that, as Lori mentioned, know them and probably are of the same risk for COVID as the child. But you know, telling people to give conventional CPR with a loved one is one thing, but then what happens if the child arrests outside the home? So this has led to some ethical issues too, I think, some ethical dilemmas for healthcare providers, for lay rescuers.
Thanks, Mary-Fran. In a moment, I'll turn over to Claire just to ask some questions. But I'm just picking up just one question that's I noted on because we got lots of questions coming in, by the way, on slide S, so keep them coming. One I want to fire to Bob because I think it links with what you were saying. The AHA guidance, and it may not be true across North America, but in terms of in-hospital cardiac arrest, are healthcare providers expected to be donning kind of full aerosol generating protection PPE before they start compressions? What can they do at a cardiac arrest?
So I'm going to say it two different ways. One, when we put together our guideline, our interim guideline about how to deal with this, it was early in the process and we knew very little about so many of the issues. And there was the bilateral concerns. One of them is, what are you doing to the poor patients that you're slowing everything down? And the other one is, how can you make recommendations that don't protect healthcare providers? So we're recommending that you do have these. When I'm in the hospital and I'm called in a rapid response team or a code team, we actually carry around in our pockets. We're not allowed to walk around without having goggles on to see patients or some sort of eye protection. We're not allowed to walk around without a regular mask. We're not supposed to go into the room for one of these without an N95 mask. We do that. Initially, we had shields, and that was that's because we had excess number of shields because of the years ago when all the Ebola stuff was going on. And we didn't have enough N95s. Now we have enough N95s, and we all walk around with N95s. The code carts have N95s and goggles in them as opposed to epinephrine. We have adrenaline as well, but I'm being a little silly, but part of the deal is a whole set of things that you can carry into the room. What else was part of that question?
That's fine. No, that's fine, Bob. No, that's great. Claire, what I'll do, I'll hand over to you
Okay.
for the time being, and then I'm going to keep screening very quickly because we've got a lot of questions coming on slide, and I want to just pick up a few of those. So if you carry on, and I'll focus.
There are some very interesting questions coming in, but I'm going to just ask Laurie really, just about COVID has obviously had an impact in a lot of training, but also I imagine on research, particularly in pre-hospital CPR research. Have you found it's affected any research you're doing or any you know about at all?
Yes, well, I think I would say worldwide in science, COVID-19 has impaired scientists. So all non-COVID research was stopped at the University of Toronto across every university in Canada. I'm sure the same occurred in my colleagues in the United States because I see them all nodding. And non-COVID science we tried to start back up just in the last 2 months until phase 2 hit. And now we're again back in lockdown. And it is made difficult when you're grant funded to support staff. We've repositioned staff, but most trials have stopped and some trials have had to close prematurely. And I know there's a group working worldwide to develop a way of documenting when you submit your paper to a high citation journal, how to indicate that this was a COVID-19 affected sample size shortening. And I think that's important because I think a lot of really good science has been negatively affected when we couldn't operate under COVID-19. Pre-hospital trials are particularly affected because it is a chaotic environment and a good day. So during a pandemic, it made it very, very difficult.
Claire, can I just add something? Jerry mentioned at the opening of the ceremonies about some good things and some bad things that have happened, and we're learning how to do some things differently. A lot of the research that we do that is observational, we've learned how to do it electronically. We've learned how to do it tele-electronically, getting consents. We've learned how to do things without without coming into the hospital to take care of it. It's been a little bit of a haul to get that through the IRB to get it in an acceptable manner. But we've been able in the hospital to do most of the kinds of research clinically that we could before, but it took us a few months to figure that out. So it's not impossible. We're just going to have to learn things, and hopefully some of those things we might get some benefit in the future, as Jerry mentioned, with some of the, like having this conference with people all over the world being able to be here.
There are some COVID-19 trials and registries that are ongoing all over the world that I just thought I'd mention as well, because some of those are going to capture cardiac arrest resuscitation outcomes. There's a large registry in the United States, there's one in Canada, there's one in Australia, there's something starting in Italy and Europe, and I think that will at least give us some data to reflect back on as we prepare for the next pandemic.
I think that's really useful, actually, to think about also ways that programs have been shortened and how we can credit that research still because of that pandemic. I'm going to hand back over to Jerry because there are a lot of questions coming through related to COVID.
Thanks, Claire. One of the ones that's caught my eye, which is a challenging question, is relates to, I'm going to read it out, it's from Michael Smith. If you could steal, I like that word, if you could steal one thing that Europe does in resuscitation that North America doesn't, what would it be? And indeed the inverse of that, what do you think that you've got great that we need to be doing? Who's brave enough to take that on?
I'll take on the good part.
Okay.
I would say that there's several countries in Europe, not Europe as a whole, several countries in Europe that have been able to put together registries and really gather all the information in a way that I'm envious of as an American. And I would, there are many of them are Scandinavian, but there's some in-hospital ones that have developed that Jerry's been involved in that are really just outstanding. And that provides the opportunity to have wide, believable databases without as much confusion about what the denominators and numerators truly are in your studies. I think that's wonderful. And the other thing that's really phenomenal from some of those studies is the duration of studies that have been done. The longer term follow-up and knowledge about what happens is something I'm just envious of as a resuscitation investigator in the United States.
Just linking up with that, why do you think that is, Bob? Why do you think it's possible to do these very much long-term outcome studies in other parts of the world, but less so in the United States? And I use the word United States.
Yes, but there's not a willingness to have everybody join in. And if anybody's seen that, we have this thing going on. There's a presidential election going on, and there's not exactly.
I didn't notice that.
In the United States. And I know we're not unique in that. I know that many of the parts of the world and many parts of Europe have similar kinds of disparate views about how life should be. But there's a lot of, in the United States, there's not a lot of people that want to have more regulations, more control, more centralized kind of things. There's a spirit of freedom and separateness that American citizens, at least some of our American citizens, enjoy greatly.
If I could respond to the question a little bit differently, yeah. Japan has an all-country out-of-hospital registry that all was developed and is required to be I don't want to say participated in, but participation is required by the Ministry of Health. And in the United States, the EMS systems are all different. They're all local EMS systems. So to get permission and to involve those patients in all those different EMS systems requires permission. Then the hospitals are separate entities, so they also must give consent. And so it would be nice if we could put everybody under the same umbrella, just so we could better share data. But the data sharing, I think, is much more difficult in the United States because of the separateness of each component of the resuscitation system.
Yeah, and I suspect that it's different all over the world, of course. I mean, the
Right.
United Kingdom will have the National Health Service, and that's one good thing about the NHS.
Right. Yep.
But other systems. Go on, Laurie.
One thing I just comment on what I've noticed with COVID-19, there was because I agree with everything that's been said about the difficulties of doing science, but with COVID-19, we were able to push the envelope. We're now doing follow-up on all the ED patients without consent, without prior notification. So we have a waiver of consent registry that is picking up all patients who are suspected and COVID positive. But we got them to actually consider that we could do 30 days, 60 days, 6 months, and 1 year without consent. We could just contact them de novo as kind of an extension of the circle of care. The concept is so foreign, but it's so lovely and welcome. And I'm hoping that maybe when the pandemic's over, we could say, see, we were really helpful and the patients were comfortable, and these kind of long-term follow-up should be routine in waiver of consent trials.
Thanks,
luck.
Laurie. Now,
It's right out there.
none of you have been brave enough to answer the second half of that, which was, what do you think we should be taking from North America? What's North America got to teach Europe in terms of resuscitation?
What is Europe? Or I think.
No, what do you think Europe should be stealing from North America?
Oh, good quality care with good professors.
Oh,
Oh,
Bob.
nicely answered.
It's 10 o'clock at night. Everybody's drinking right now. You can't have these bland comments. I have to say something.
Well, I have to say, I understand that this is being streamed to a lot of bars and pubs. I think
I
that's
wasn't joking.
a way to really warm up folks to interaction. I think maybe we should be borrowing that. I do think that with under the guise of ILCOR, I tend not to think of America has this and Europe has this and Japan has this, but we all are sharing so much. And I think that has been an extraordinary benefit of ILCOR, so that I think it has stimulated research and it has helped us leapfrog over one another to get us all performing better quality CPR and better quality research.
Okay, thanks, Mary.
I'll take one. I'll take one hit on this, which is that some of my colleagues have said that one thing that the U.S. has is it has a really well-established infrastructure of the basic sciences and laboratories and some things like that I think many people in Europe and in Asia, they come to the United States to learn from, take advantage of. And I do think that just staying connected to laboratory investigation, to laboratory discovery, to things that are going on is increasingly important as we move resuscitation forward. And I'm never going to claim that we do a fabulous job of integrating all that basic science at this point, but I think it is one of our opportunities that we offer.
Yeah, thanks, Lance. I think that is a very good point, actually. I think basic science in the States is particularly strong. I'm going to take the opportunity to link it with a question that's just come in, because it's right up your street. And the question is, if you should advise a young researcher to focus on one subject to revolutionize CPR for the future, what would the subject be? And that's got to be Lance.
Well, you know, I have multiple ones, and so now you'll hear if what they hear is any good. But I do think that, one of the large domains really is sort of this borderline in terms of life and death. It's sort of, what is the difference between life and death of a person, of an organism, of an organ, of a cell? And I think that there's just so much in that we don't yet know. And I think that our ignorance is remarkable in a lot of this. And so I think for a young person who's brave, I think there are just enormous opportunities in that. And whether they go into, I could give some specific examples, but I think sort of immersing yourself in understanding really what the future is going to be, maybe not so much the future that we see in 5 years or 10 years, but, really looking to see, what are we going to learn in 20 years that is going to really remarkably change the way we think about when a person has approached the death zone, and when they're really dead or just a little bit dead. And I think that those are going to be very hot areas, and the basic science in that is really continuing. Now I hope this is late at night, so I hope you've sent the children to bed. Do you know what I mean? Because if I might say some things that children shouldn't hear. In my family, there was a time when that had to happen. But, I don't think we've done a great job in terms of protecting our pipeline in this as a community now. And I mean, in Europe, in Canada, in the United States, I see a shriveling, if you will, of the basic science laboratories. And those were the things that really made all the discoveries, when we learned about defibrillation, or whether we learned about CPR, those were all things that came directly out of work that took place in laboratories, and people had ideas about it. And those laboratories have severely atrophied. I'll be very polite in my language, even though all the children have gone to bed. And I do think that we have sort of a collective responsibility to think of how we're going to not let that diminish to a point where it threatens the future of resuscitation, or it threatens a stalling of resuscitation science, because I think that's what we're in right now. And I guess I'll just label it that, as I look at the science that's coming out, there's just not the quantity of science coming out these last few years. And that's very perturbing to me. I say nasty things about that at times. So I think that's what I would tell a young person, is that this is a time of remarkable opportunity, that they'll need to be intensely passionate about it, but that the vistas and the horizons are truly remarkable.
Thanks, Lawrence. Claire, did you want to perhaps take over from me? And we had some, I think, questions for Mary Fran, actually. I know we've gone slightly out of the sequence we were planning, but why don't you take those for Mary Fran?
So Mary Fran, if I wouldn't mind asking you, so you work within guidelines and the AHA guidelines. What do you think are sort of main 3 topics that are likely to impact the 2020 AHA guidelines? I know you have been directly involved per se.
Yeah. And I co-edited the COSTAR, and so this year I was not involved with the guidelines other than as a fly in the room, if you will. I think the 3 things that we've talked about are CPR quality still is so important, and we have to measure outcomes and we have to monitor quality. We have to, that includes training and refreshing folks, and we're getting more and more data about how important that is. Debriefing folks, that's very important. And by the way, I'm just serving with this as a warm-up act for Bob Berg and Lance Becker, because Bob is going to talk about hemodynamic monitoring, and they're doing wonderful work at Penn, and Lance is going to talk about some neuroprognostication. So those are hot topics. I think in peds, in terms of basic life support, I would say that this whole issue of the respiratory rate has been interesting. We were intrigued by a study that came out of Penn with Bob Berg and Vinay as senior authors, but Bobby Sutton's work looking at respiratory rate. And although he had a small study involving, I think, 47 patients, The respiratory rate they found was not consistent with AHA guidelines of a rate of 8 per minute in any of the patients, but in doing a kind of statistical analysis, a cubic spline analysis, they found that the patients who received the infants that received a respiratory rate of 30 or more, or children who received a respiratory rate of 25 or more, that was associated with survival. Very small study, but it made an impression on the AHA guidelines. And if you recall, the respiratory rate of 8 during CPR in a patient with an advanced airway was selected as to minimize inconsistencies between adult and pediatric resuscitation, but we had no data. So now we have a little bit of data, and I think that was persuasive. I know that was persuasive for the AHA guidelines, and I've not yet had a chance to look at the ERC guidelines. Epinephrine remains important. We have more information from—
Mary Fran, can I just interrupt for a second there? And I'm going to go back to Jerry's question. What kind of things can people do? Relatively simple. It's not just kids versus adults. It's in hospital versus out of hospital.
Yeah.
Those adult things are all from out of hospital.
Yeah.
A large number, there's about an equal number of people getting CPR in hospitals. So those of you in this audience that want to make a difference, go look at in-hospital CPR in your area. Find out that the adults with in-hospital CPR on ventilators with lung disease are a different population than the patients that are out of hospital walking around and collapse. And you might find out exactly the same thing as we found out in children. Yeah. We weren't expecting it. We didn't know, but we didn't know because we didn't look.
Well, but also we have been saying for a long time, kids are different because most of their cardiac arrest, even in the hospital, it is asphyxial arrest. And so these aren't kids that have well oxygenated blood until their heart stops. They slow down because they're hypoxic. And so it makes sense that kids would need a faster respiratory rate than would adults that have an arrhythmic arrest. But as Bob points out, if the adult has a hypoxic arrest and an asphyxial arrest, then that adult may well need more ventilation during CPR, especially with an advanced airway. Epinephrine during CPR remains an important topic. I think those of you in ERC will recall in 2019, when we published the COSTAR statement, there was a it was controversial about epinephrine because the Paramedic 2 trial was perceived to be a negative trial about epinephrine because there was improvement in survival and in ROSC and survival, but no improvement in neurologically intact survival. But the ILCOR group, in looking at that study and looking at some observations—
sound, Mary Fran, for some reason.
Pardon me? I'm sorry, pardon me? Did I lose my sound?
No, you're clear as a bell.
You're okay here.
So it's me.
Okay, all right.
Very.
Claire, keep chairing for the moment and I'll figure out what's going on.
Okay, so, but in fact, the ILCOR group thought, well, you need to get ROSC and you need to get survival before you can see improvement in neurologically intact survival, number one. And number two, the patients in that out-of-hospital Paramedic 2 trial received the epinephrine pretty late. And so the question is, if you give it really late, can you really judge its effect on outcome? And so, but there are some observational studies, both in pediatric and adult, that suggest that the earlier you give epinephrine, especially for those with non-shockable rhythms, that's been associated with, again, not controlled studies, associated with improved survival. And so giving epinephrine early in, especially for those with non-arrest or non-VF, non-shockable rhythms, is very important. And then the third point is post-resuscitation care is really essential, and that includes targeted temperature management. We've got more data on that, and we're gaining more information about prognostication that Lance will be talking about. But all this CPR has to be delivered within a system of care that looks at outcome, looks at training, but must look at quality of CPR delivered. So that's kind of a quick hit the things that I think will influence guidelines. We're going to see more and more data about what we need to monitor post resuscitation and maintain blood pressure, maintain oxygenation and ventilation, and control temperature, so that we're not allowing fever, and then selecting if patients should be cooled colder rather than to 37 degrees. But that temperature has to be controlled so nobody gets febrile post resuscitation.
I think leading on from that, thank you very much, Mary Fran. I don't know if Jerry is still with us, so I'm going to now take over because he's lost his sound, I think.
Okay,
So,
because
Lon,
I was going to ask him as co-chair if he had anything to add that he wanted to touch upon, but
I'm so sorry. He's disappeared, I think, in Bath.
okay. I do want to, if I could interject, we had just
Take control.
wonderful writing group chairs, and you've heard from many of them yesterday.
Mhm.
But here's Jerry.
Oh,
And
welcome back, Jerry.
Jerry has always provided wonderful input and editing. Did you have any other topics that you wanted to raise as the top three, Jerry?
I do not want to add to your topics, Mary Fran, because I'm conscious of time, and I want to move
Okay.
on to some of the other. We had a couple of other things that we want to address.
So-
Actually, before I'm going to come to Bob next, and my apologies for that slight technical glitch, which I don't fully understand, but there we go. Bob, I was going to ask you about physiological monitoring during CPR. Before I do that, one of the questions on Slido related to back to COVID was this multi-system inflammatory disease that is being seen in children in some parts of the world. Certainly, I know there's reports out of London. Is that something that you've been seeing as well?
Yeah, we've seen a lot more of that than acute COVID. We've had a lot of patients that have had COVID and other diseases, and it probably didn't help them much, but it was not like severe COVID that adults get too often. We've had a few, but not too many. But we've had quite a few patients with MISC, is what we call it in the States, it's a very odd disease. It has some components that are similar to Kawasaki disease. For those of you that know about that disease, it looks a little bit more like Kawasaki shock disease, as Dr. Levine has shown from London. We've had the same sort of thing, and it has a set of inflammatory mediators that is a bit unique in terms of which ones go up and in what order but at the end of it all, most of them do pretty well. Some of them have coronary artery disease like Kawasaki's, and there have been some deaths from it, but they're really, really a small number of patients. So it's unpleasant. We have a large center for a children's hospital, a 600-bed children's hospital, sort of pretty large in the world. So we certainly have seen a moderate number of them. But I do want people who are all worried about their kids in the audience to know that the most likely thing happens if you're a kid and you get COVID is that you're asymptomatic. And if you do get COVID and you get sick, it's most likely to be minimally sick. And if you do get sick and you get very sick, you probably had a pre-existing other thing. And then some very small number of them have a post-inflammatory process. And I got to tell you, just about every viral illness that we know has post-inflammatory associated processes. So I don't want to raise this up as worry about your kids today, because that's what it really feels like to my kids, to my in-laws, my daughter-in-laws and son-in-laws. They're all worried stiff that their kids are going to, some terrible things about to happen to many minutes. It's an incredibly rare event.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Claire, go on.
I think I was going to, we were just touching on it as well with targeted temperature management, going on from what Mary Fran was saying. Laurie, would you or Lance be able to answer about sort of novel neuroprotective therapies, if there's anything new on the horizon that you're working on, and physiological monitoring? I'll go to Laurie first.
That's definitely Lance's bailiwick.
Lance's field? Come on, Lance. Sorry, Lance.
Well, I'm happy to share.
Like 5 seconds, 5 inches from the screen.
And you've only got one, and you've got about a minute to answer it as well, Lance.
There you go.
fun,
I think to me, it looks like the exciting stuff is the idea of putting a cocktail together. And so it's the notion that there's not just one thing that's wrong with the brain after a cardiac arrest.
Yeah.
But we've identified in the laboratory, 5, 6, 7 major pathways that are they've gone wonky. The antioxidants have gone wonky, the mitochondria have gone wonky, the substrates have gone wonky, cell death pathways have gone wonky. There's new lipid data that a bunch of the lipids are completely wonky in your plasma, all right? And so, the opportunity is to now really think about how you can put a cocktail together that will really, in a synergistic way, go after multiple of those pathways. What we've done probably over the last 30 years is we've tried single agent remedies.
Looking
And
for
we've
a
tried it.
silver bullet.
We've tried it for stroke, and we've tried it for a whole bunch of things in the brain. And for the most part, with some limited successes, we haven't seen great successes. But if you just think about this crazy article that anyone in resuscitation should read from Yale, from Ninad Stestan, Ninad took decapitated pig brains and very much showed that you could bring them back to like a state of function 4 hours after they had been severed from the body of the pig. All right. And, most of us grew up in a world where we thought, 4 minutes of ischemia and, you're going to have permanent brain injury. And really the data, and I do want to say, if you it's a paper in Nature, it's an amazing paper. But he used a complete cocktail after that. He went after every one of those pathways that I just described in sort of a synergistic fashion.
Lost him.
Oh, we've lost
Back.
Lance.
And so I think that this horizon just opens it up.
Okay, Lance, thanks.
Lance, we're hoping that you're going to have much better science on that particular cocktail than the one that the president drank.
That seems like a very
Look,
very good
there's-
comment to finish on before we
Sorry,
start
there's
getting into
people that I would share my cocktail with. There's people that I would not share my cocktail with.
It's fair to point out that the pigs you were describing didn't exactly have a good neurological outcome, though. Anyway,
It is fair to point that out, but it's also fair to just point out that they stopped the experiment at 10 hours because they had serious concerns that the brains might become aware.
Yeah,
and
no,
so
it's a fascinating study.
They stopped it at.
Yeah. No. Okay, I'm conscious that we are a minute over time, and with that, I think we need to bring this session to a close, largely because the European audience will need to get down to the wine bars or pubs or whatever, if they're not already there. Can I just thank all of the 4 panelists for a superb discussion, which we could have gone on for a couple of hours with at least. I'd like to thank Claire Morton as my fellow moderator, and Helene, who's been sorting out the technical issues, including sorting out my personal technical issue, which I apologise for. And I wish you all good day or good night or good morning, depending on where in the world you are. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.